Yes, thank you very much, Shawn. I'm going to bring you to the stage now so we can start the Q&A. Um, Hi, how are you doing?
Good to see you.
Where are you calling in from today?
I am in a cafe in Beirut, Lebanon, the only place where there is electricity in the daytime.
So we got you at exactly the right time to get started. I'm so glad you got time and a space to answer some of our questions. So we're gonna just get started. One of the questions in the chat is, what are the story moments that could be most useful for data visualizations?
For anyone doing data storytelling, I think it's important to focus on the moment where information is delivered and how to set that up. There's a lot of tools out there that you can use that give you full width images, full screen videos, and there's so many different tools that you can use. But what's important is to think about that moment when you're giving the key figure. And even if you were just writing that in plain text, maybe you would use bold text to emphasize the key important points. You can start by simply just using headers in a Google Doc and organizing things into headers and smaller points and bullet points. But what's important is focusing on the moment when that key information is delivered. And if you set it up using an emotion or using a build up, using a crescendo to arrive at that moment, it can be that much more impactful when the reader gets that key statistic.
Okay, so it's like the build up to the main key takeaway that you want to make for the
I guess what
audience.
I'm looking at is what are the elements of build up? How do you build up attention and suspense and then get to that moment? That's a story could be based off one simple number or just one fact that you're trying to present to people. And if you can use the technology to make it more impactful, then it'll be that much. It'll reach people in a way that they'll remember and that they'll come away with thinking like, I read this, like I saw this cool visualization, I saw this cool website. I can't remember. I think it's Malcolm Gladwell. He says in his master class that the way that people talk to each other at parties is what you should be thinking about when you're creating any kind of story for people. Because when people say, I read this cool piece in New York Times, or I read this blog, and it taught me something interesting, and the way that that people tell it to, that they actually communicate what they remembered to their friends or to their colleagues, that's what you want to be thinking about, the way that you want to input that in your story.
Okay, thank you very much. In your talk, you also talk a lot about melody. And in the introduction, we saw that you work a lot for conflict and journalism. So, how do you work melody into a story about conflict?
Yeah, I talked about this a bit in the presentation about when I'm crafting a narrative, and I think about melody in the same way I think about narrative. It's about when is the time that the narrative builds. And as I said, melody, you could think of melody as your main character, and still there's a context around. I mean, the reason that you use any data and make a decision to put a character in a story or to put a figure in a story, whether you're writing a narrative about people and collecting data in terms of quotes and interviews, like I would as a journalist, that's a decision to include data, and that all can serve the main narrative that you're going to. Or maybe it's the harmony, maybe it's that contextual information about how does this one person's story, or how does this one piece of data connect to a larger trend. So I think of that contextual information as the harmony, as elements that serve the melody, your main point that you're trying to drive home for the reader. I mean, there's always a story that you can have anecdotally from a person. It's almost a cliche that journalists like to include their kind of anecdotes about talking to taxi drivers or the average person on the street. But news uses this a lot, the kind of vox pop or man on the street interview that's supposed to kind of represent something larger. I think these are elements that you can weave together, and you've got to think about why are you using that, and why is this data pointing here, and is it serving the larger narrative?
Okay, thank you very much. I see that the chat is blowing up, so we will move on to the next question. How do you address accessibility challenges for visuals that rely on motion? For example, flatten the curve graphics.
Accessibility is becoming I've noticed it in the past few years. It's becoming mainstream, which is really exciting to see that, we're not just considering this as something secondary, but it's primary. And it even comes down to not just about alt text or screen readers, or anyone who's interested in this topic should really check out in the viewing room the talk by I hope I get their names right, Anna, Lucia, and Becky and Shawn from the BBC. They had an amazing talk about making visualizations by the BBC accessible in 40 languages and making sure that not just text but graphs read right to left. So I'm going to pivot to those experts.
Refer it on. Okay. The next question is, I love the idea of thinking of your viz in another language and seeing if you still get the point across or the vibe. Can you give any tips or techniques to test how effective your storytelling is, except for you putting it in another language?
Yeah, I really learned a lot from visual vocabulary from design, and that's very much part of my philosophy is that we can learn a lot from each other by learning from different disciplines, even if you don't consider yourself a designer, or even if you don't consider yourself a techie. I mean, those are more primary elements of communication that, what size communicates, what proximity communicates. If you have, if you put an image of two people facing each other versus two people facing away from each other, that says something different. And these are more primary elements of visual vocabulary that you can get from design. And I'm sure that there's more we can learn from psychology, from anthropology. I'm just really excited about how much we can learn from each other's different disciplines.
All right. You showed us some examples from media outlets. Which media outlets are your favorites in creating data-driven stories? You showed the example of the New York Times and a few others, but do you have an all-time favorite?
An all-time favorite, I will go back to the basics. I remember it must be like 2012, so 10 years ago. I was an editor at Medium when they first started playing around with more advanced design capabilities on their pages. There was a piece, and it comes even a few months before the famous Snowfall multimedia that just kicked off this avalanche of multimedia stories. But there was a story, it was called Barrel of a Gun, and it was a really simple, just personal essay about a kid who was walking home one night on Halloween, and a car pulled up to him, and some guys pulled a gun on him, put it in his face, and he got scared and ran away. And it's about that scary experience, but in the moment where the gun gets pointed at the narrator, he freezes, and then it's just the background changed when the user would scroll, and the background would turn black, and then the text would go away, and then it would fade up, and it said "I ran." And when I saw that, my mind was blown, because this was just like a moment that fed the story. He just said, it's like time froze, and then the whole screen changed, and I wasn't expecting it. It's like, wow, a website can do this with a story. It was like incredible. So I always go back to that moment, that it was like, it wasn't just parallaxing to look pretty, but it was totally serving the story. And it was just, I still remember it 10 years later.
Cool. Music is a very persuasive in the language you use. Should we collaborate with musicians if we're telling our data stories?
Everyone should listen to classical music. Everyone should listen to all types of music, because music is a way of storytelling without words, even without symbols, really. It's, I listen to Beethoven's 23rd Sonata Appassionata, and I feel a whole story about somebody struggling. And I think it was Lenin who said, if I listen to Appassionata, then I won't be able to finish the revolution because it's too beautiful, and I have to smash heads to finish the revolution. And and I can feel it when I listen to it. Or when you listen to Gustav Mahler's 10th Symphony, you can feel this kind of straining. And if you look at his life and what he was going through in that time, and just musically, it's an incredibly complex symphony. I really encourage. I mean, we should definitely collaborate with musicians. We should consume music, and we should feel music, and figure out how to incorporate that in stories. And then, yeah, definitely, like if you can collaborate with musicians to make data sonified, I mean, I think there's so much incredible potential there.
Awesome. Sounds very good. I think a lot of people will be very happy to hear that in the sonification program here.
I think it should be both ways. I think that music has something to offer, and then when we take something from music and bring it into the story, and then like take something from story and then make something musical out of it, it's like so many possibilities.
It works both ways. Perfect. In your experience, what are the strategies you've used to increase uptake or community literacy of your story, especially with the data involved?
I think it was I'm blanking on whose talk it was yesterday, but was talking about how much literacy of charts has increased in the time of the pandemic. I'm blanking on the person's name because I'm embarrassed because they seem to be
Fields, I think.
A top-notch expert in the field, and but this is something I think we've really we need to increase literacy. I think we need to increase literacy of how the media work and how we collect information, how journalists work, how a chart gets made, what kind of choices that go into it. It's even something as simple that you might forget about just putting the axis on it. Because and someone else said, I think in an unconference talk, to do the mom check, just check it with someone who's not a data viz person. Then they say like, okay, this is a cool chart, but what is it supposed to be saying? And you might just have forgotten to label the axes or to put an annotation in there to say, this data is from this, and it's might be not perfectly certain, and charts can lie. So. And people are starting to understand that, and they're starting to increase their literacy about how to read a chart. So that's important, and we should keep focusing on that and keep making the behind the scenes more public, so people understand, how things are made, and that also makes it more accessible in terms of just making it something that people can get involved with if they want to. I think it's one thing that. And I'll come back to my point about collaborating. Journalists have this really great skill about speaking in common language that is easy for people to understand. That's a simple is always best. And that's something that we can definitely all strive for, to make things more, common language, layperson speak, so that people understand what we're doing. And it doesn't seem something ivory tower or elitist to do it, because, data is for everyone.